Okay, we're ready to go.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to URO's Town Hall Conversation and Discussion Series, where we're really looking at issues of reentry, policing, mass incarceration. URO is an organization focused on systemic change in these areas. And we felt that this series, an ongoing series, will be necessary for community engagement to bring what we feel is some of the best information out there, so that communities, our community and our stakeholders have the information, tools, and resources to kind of execute a vision of what we feel we want our future to be. So I guess I did introduce myself. We also have a great group of panelists here that are going to share some expertise on what we think will lead to kind of healing practices in our community. This podcast kind of was initiated due to the Reimagining Policing project, where information came out and ideas were spurned, but I thought that we needed to do a deeper dive into information and really come up with solutions that are going to fit our community, but have already shown kind of efficacy in other communities. So that's why we have Lisa Fujie Parks here from the Prevent Institute, as well as Charles Ransford from Cure Violence. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Olivia Balcos, who will be our moderator for today. Olivia.
Hi, my name is Olivia. I'm an aspiring community healer, and I was invited by a connection who thought that I would be a good fit for this team for today, and also thought that I would be interested in these topics, and I really am. And today we'll be talking about the theme of like healing the soul of our communities, and the team has prepared a lot of great questions. So we have our first question for Charlie and Lisa. How do you define violence in the context of your research and work?
You can go ahead, Lisa, if you want to start.
Okay, sure. Well, it's really an honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I grew up I went to high school in Ithaca, New York, and just have so much love for Ithaca and Tompkins County. And yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit about our work. And I really appreciate the theme of healing the soul of our communities. And so maybe I'll just talk a little bit about that, and then talk about how we define violence. I really appreciate the centering healing in the conversation, because it really acknowledges that there has been a tremendous amount of violence in our communities for generations. And in fact, the history of the founding of this country is a history that includes a tremendous amount of violence. And so violence is not new, it's been ongoing, and it's a human problem, a global problem that impacts many of us, impacts our communities differentially, but one that we all can and need to heal from. And so even as we're talking about what can prevent violence, or how do we address it, this need for healing from the violence that's already occurred is so important. And my understanding of violence is definitely includes the interpersonal violence that we might talk about, but also includes structural and systemic violence, including structural racism and other forms of structural inequities. And I think fundamentally, I think about violence in the context of power and the abuse of power and the harm that can be done when power is used over another person or a group of people to exploit or control or harm as a means to exploit or control individuals, families, and communities over generations. So that's a little bit about how I think about violence and how it that understanding definitely shapes our work.
Thanks everyone for inviting me here. I really appreciate this event and being able to talk here. At Cure Violence, for a long time, we've used the definition of violence from the WHO, the World Health Organization, which I think is tremendously helpful just, for their stature and just in terms of what the definition is. So they define it as the use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, and that it results in either or even just has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So, I mean, there's a lot there that it's not just power, it's not just the actual direct violence that we think of, but it's also the use of power. And it's not just actual violence, it's actually, it could be threatened violence that can also be very damaging. And then, even against oneself, or it could be against a whole community or an individual. And that it's not just things that result in physical injury, but also psychological and also maldevelopment and deprivation. So it's a broad definition. And so I think it's very useful in that way because it does really capture a lot of, I think, what is actually violence. In terms of our work, though, we are a public health organization. We address violence as a public health issue. And as a health organization and as health practitioners, we have a bias towards those most in need. And so what we look to do is, we want to be helping people that are the most involved or caught up in violence. We want to be going to communities with the biggest problems. So, in the US, we work in places like Chicago and Washington, D.C. and St. Louis. We work in Honduras and Colombia, Mexico. So we're really going to the cities with the most killings, the communities with the most concentration. And, but yeah, I mean, I think that the other thing to know about our work is, we are known for community-based violence prevention and reducing violence in communities, but a lot of what that involves can sometimes be domestic violence. In Central America, it could be cartel violence. We get involved in belief-inspired violence and prison violence and political violence. So, we are trying to address a wide variety of violence as much as we can and put ourselves in places where we can be useful, and with the bias of really trying to go towards the places that are most in need.
Yeah, I'm seeing from both organizations a wide a need to have to define violence as many different types. Usually it's easy to think of violence as just physical, but there's emotional violence, there's group violence, there's community violence, there's so many different types of violence. And if we were to help people or look at things from a public health perspective, you have to take in consideration all types of violence, and it's important to define those things so they don't get left out. And Charlie, you've already talked about your organization, but you can share anything else about the mission, founding principles, and values of your organization, and that goes also to Lisa too.
Yeah, I really like your comment too. I mean, I think the thing about these types of violence is they're kind of like silos, and all violence is related. I mean, the hate speech we see drives violent acts and protests. The police violence that we see causes trauma that then can drive violence in the community. The violence all of this is one problem, and breaking it up into different groups really is not very helpful because there's a lot of crossover. And so we really have to be dealing with the whole problem of violence. In terms of our mission, Cure Violence, our mission is just simply to reduce violence globally using disease control and behavior change methods. And since we're doing behavior change, credibility is incredibly important. We're hiring people from the community. Actually, we don't do the hiring. It's local organizations that are implementing the model. A local organization that has a reputation And then they're hiring people that have a reputation in the community, can really meet the people who are most caught up in violence and can really help them out and have conversations with them. So it's all locally owned. Our role is really just to guide and train the organizations and the communities to be as successful as they can. I mean, it's completely locally owned. The success is locally owned. We just, we provide the training and technical assistance. And, the effects of the program, we typically see large drops in violence within the first month or two. Sometimes in communities, it can take longer just in terms of the dynamics in that community, but several evaluations have shown reductions within the first few months. And we've had 8 evaluations now with, drops in violence of 60% or so, and another dozen studies or so. So, all these studies are showing like positive effects and large reductions on violence. And so, there's just, I think, one of the things, in terms of like how we are implementing it, we're going to places like Latin America. And, we have teams who know how to implement in Latin America. It's incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging to find inroads into populations wrapped up in violence in communities in Latin America. But we have a team who knows how to do it and knows how to help coach people to do it. St. Louis is a city that's in the top 10 globally, top 10 of most violent cities. And we have a team that knows how to go in there and really be able to help the people in the community to be able to address violence. So, anyone can implement a program. I think at Cure Violence, what we bring is we're the experts at really knowing how to get it to work.
That's great. I'm going to go back to your comment about how violence fragments, and then I'll talk about Prevention Institute's work a little bit, but I really have seen, and I can speak to this personally as someone who has experienced violence, is violence, it fragments our ability to connect. It harms our ability to trust. And so every instance of violence and types of violence, generations, it creates disconnection in our communities. And that's what we end up seeing, is silos and isolated people and isolated groups. And the solution really is, as Charlie said, about healing that and reweaving that and building a society that is inclusive and equitable and fair and safe. And to do that, it really requires everyone, right? We all have to, in our day-to-day actions, relate to other people and to other beings and to the land in a way that doesn't rely on abuse of power, it doesn't rely on violence. And so that leads me to talk about Prevention Institute a little bit, because I think we come at the issue from a different perspective and play a different role. And yet, all of these different approaches and contributions that are aimed at healing and that are aimed at creating equity and safety are needed. So Prevention Institute, we work on multiple issues. Violence and trauma are one of the issues, but our fundamental vision is around everyone having equitable opportunity to achieve their full health potential. And when we talk about health, we talk about it very broadly to include safety, well-being. We talk about emotional and spiritual dimensions of health, safety, and well-being. So, and our unit we're fundamentally oriented toward working in community and at the level of community. And so our tagline is health, safety, and well-being through thriving, equitable communities. And our beliefs and our values are really that when there is racial justice, when there is gender justice, when there is economic justice, and all communities have access to the conditions that are needed for people to be healthy and safe, when people have access to those fundamental determinants of health and safety, like housing and economic opportunity and food security and social and emotional connection, then we have safe communities. And so, and typically the kinds of needs that people have that end up reducing violence are also the kinds of things that end up helping on other related issues as well. So we work at the community level, and we work across issues. And I'd love to give a couple examples of communities where we've worked and some of the outcomes and results of that as well. So one community is Santa Clara County here in California, and that's where the city of San Jose is located. And we worked with the health department and community organizations to create the East San Jose Peace Partnership with residents and community groups and county departments. And we created a structure where residents would have the greatest decision-making power in how resources were spent and influencing how county entities operated and behaved in the neighborhood. So created a leadership team and decision-making structures. Also created what is called a wellness fund, which is a vehicle for different funding sources, local, federal, state, philanthropy, to put money to invest in the neighborhood, but to give decision-making power to the residents. And so different funding entities could put money in this fund, and then this leadership team that is 75% residents would vote on proposals for how that money could be spent. Some of the interventions that the Peace Partnership has engaged in are things like hiring residents as promotoras or health promoters to work on domestic violence and healthy relationships and support economic opportunity, creating culturally relevant parks and recreation and youth leadership opportunities for young people who are at risk for involvement in the justice system, working on things that were disrupting the neighborhood like gentrification, also working on gun safety measures and dealing with the proliferation of illegal guns in the neighborhood and those types of things. But really from this perspective that when the community is organized and has power, collective power, it can advocate for its needs, and community members really need to be the ones who are determining the strategies, the programs, what gets implemented, and they also should be the ones who are implementing. But we help to create that infrastructure and decision-making process that has been helping to not only deal with different forms of violence, but also to create greater economic prosperity in the neighborhood as well. So I have other examples that I could share, but I'll leave it there for now, and I'm sure we could talk more about the other examples later.
Yeah, thank you for sharing an overview of your work. It seems like some themes that I'm seeing are being part of like big organizations, but really focusing on guiding the people or giving back more power to the locals and ensuring that they have more say in terms of like what they want from their communities. Is that right?
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, so going on to, we'd like to talk about like some more specifics about each organization. So for Charlie, I'm curious about what you see is the relationship between the spread of violence and the spread of diseases scientifically. I know that this is something that you'd probably do more in your work.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just to say real quick to Lisa, I mean, I think I've been familiar with the Prevention Institute for a long time, and I think they just do incredible work with helping communities on first of all, on a broad array of issues, as you can tell, but also just like really key the engagement with the community. It's really impressive stuff, and they've been doing it for a long time. I mean, Cure Violence, we kind of focus in on violence specifically and really try to, I mean, our role as we see it as really focusing in on what's happening right now and trying to stop it in terms of the violence. And so like part of that is this theory of violence as a contagious problem. And basically, I mean, what that is saying is that like other contagions, it's exposure that is leading to the problem itself replicating. So like if somebody's exposed to flu, that flu then is taken in and affects a part of their body and it replicates, and then that person could pass it on to somebody else. I mean, we're familiar with this with COVID. I think everyone understands how contagions work. And this is exactly how violence works too, that a person is exposed to violence, they visually take it in, or maybe they take it in in terms of an experience of something that they're directly experiencing. And then it directly affects the brain. It directly affects the part of their body. It can change the structure of the cortex. It can create hypersensitivity. There's just a whole range of ways in which it affects the function and structure of the brain. And so, we can understand violence in this different way. And there's a ton of evidence for it, showing it like this. First of all, I think we're all familiar with the clustering of violence, that we see certain pockets of places where there's more violence than others. You can also see it spreading, like in time, that an event in one place leads to more retaliations, or maybe it's one community is violent and then slowly over time it starts to go into the next community over. I mean, these are things that I think we see both in space and time. We see this spreading. But there's a ton of evidence on the transmission too. People returning from war that have PTSD and then having higher aggression in their communities or being violent in their homes. Child abuse, victims of child abuse being much more likely to become future child abusers. There's just a ton of research in the community violence as well, just in how violence spreads through social networks. Andy Papachristos has done a lot of work on that, and others. And then, just in terms of like how exposure, how it works. One of the real big questions that we're trying to figure out and that we're working with researchers on is like, what does dose mean? And what does, how much does dose matter? Things like direct experience, make it much more likely that you're going to pick up violent behavior yourself. Or if you see a loved one that is hurt as opposed to somebody you don't know, or if it's something you hear about or something you see. I mean, it's something you see is much more traumatic. And so, we're learning much more about like how it transmits, what puts somebody at greater risk for developing this behavior. And what this all is it's really, what it means is it's not excuses. It's not like saying this person's violent behavior is okay because we found the reasons why. But it's really finding ways to intervene beforehand. It's like if we could start to recognize that exposure matters, then when a violent event happens, we could respond differently. We could better understand individuals, that we could understand this person who's aggressive, that they might have a problem with trauma, that they're not a bad person, they're not, it's not bad choices, but instead, we don't have to blame them, but we can just understand their problem and get the help that they need. So we could treat it much differently as a health problem with care and understanding. And we get out of this idea of judging people and blaming people. And instead, we just get them the help they need. And I mean, in emergency rooms, other healthcare settings, you never ask the question, does this person deserve treatment? Is this person deserving of something? Or did they do something bad in which I should not treat them? You just treat the person who has the issue. And so we need to get away from this blaming and judgment and get towards just actually helping the people that we know need help. I mean, there's a lot of other things too. I mean, the Prevention Institute does great work on addressing families and schools. A lot of groups are out there addressing jobs. I think that what the White House has recently done on poverty has been great and is really promising. I think all of this can be better understood in a framework of health. Violence is a health issue. And so what these things do is they just make somebody much more susceptible to developing violent behavior. It puts them in places where they might be much more likely to be exposed. If they are exposed, they might not have the resources to get the treatment that they need. So, I mean, it really affects, it's tremendously important, these things. But I think, they not only affect the susceptibility for violence, they affect a person's susceptibility for AIDS or for tuberculosis or for heart disease. So, I mean, these other issues are very important, but I think it's really important that we put it in the framing of violence as a health issue and understanding violence as a health issue.
Yeah, I like how you said how if a person is physically sick, we're not going to say like, oh, they can't be treated. It's totally their fault. They got it from somewhere. There are like causes of it. And for a person to be violent or to be a victim of violence, what are the root causes of that and why is it spreading? And who is teaching them that? And I'm also wondering there's a lot of, we see a lot of violence in like social media and like how that can, people can influence each other's actions. Can you say more about how you see violence in social media as a place of contamination?
Yeah, I mean, you have violence in social media is kind of like violence on TV as well, and mass media. I mean, I think we see a lot of stuff spreading in that way. I mean, in terms of exposure to violence, stuff that we see online, stuff that we see on TV, it's not as traumatic. So it's not something that is going to necessarily spread it in that way, although it does increases people aggression. I mean, there's been 40-year studies that have shown this. But yeah, I think what's happening with social media is a little bit unique, because what happens is arguments can start there, disrespect can start there, and then it could spill into the community. Somebody can try to go and find somebody. We see that happening in our sites, in our communities a lot, and it's increasing. And in some areas, they actually have what we call e-interrupters, because they're on the computer, they're looking at different platforms, and they're trying to detect any conflict that might blow up in the streets. And then they would send a violence interrupter there to kind of interrupt that. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack with social media, not just with community violence, but with political violence, with domestic violence, and with different other problems like masculinity and norms around that sort of thing. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think it's also an opportunity for intervention, because we could start to identify people, and then you can go out and find people and try to intervene with people. But yeah, it's just a tremendously complex issue, unfortunately, with social media.
I think it speaks more to how violence can be really viral, and it's always spreading. And we have this term here, the plague of violence, seeing violence as a plague. Do you want to say more about that?
I mean, I think the term plague is used colloquially as meaning a epidemic in a way. And so, yeah, I mean, violence is an epidemic. It meets the definition of an epidemic. It clusters, it spreads, and it transmits. That is an epidemic. I mean, it actually meets the definition of a disease too. It alters the function and structure of a part of the body. Now, I don't need to get hung up on definitions. I mean, if the words disease don't work for people, I certainly don't want to use things that don't work for people. But I think what it shows us is, like, violence as a plague or violence as a contagion. What it shows us, though, is a better way to understand people and a better way to understand communities and what they're experiencing. And it could also point to some ways that we can intervene to help.
Yeah, and I think I remember you saying like a lot about prevention and how to prevent violence, but I'm wondering if we see violence as an epidemic, then how does that, how would you cure it? How does that approach how you cure it?
Well, in general, contagions, there's three ways that you can kind of cure it. It's medication or vaccines. It's behavior change, or it's other kinds of treatment. And yeah, I mean, obviously, we can see this with other diseases too. Like, certainly most contagions we don't fight with vaccines. It's nice when we can. But with COVID, before we had vaccines, we had masks. It's a behavior, and now we're having treatment, which is helpful as well. With malaria, it's using bed nets. That's that kind of behavior. With AIDS, it's largely condom use, partner limiting, that sort of thing. So it's largely behavior. Now there's a lot of treatment too that's really helpful. So yeah, I mean, I think understanding violence, it does lead to a lot of ways that we can cure it. I mean, cure does not mean a medicine that we give somebody and the problem goes away. I mean, with COVID, we have a quote unquote cure, but the problem hasn't gone away because we haven't found a way to make that feasible. But yeah, I mean, it could point to ways in which we can cure it for an individual. Individual can be cured of violent behavior. There are ways to get somebody out of that loop. And then because we can cure it for the individual, we can start to cure it for the community by really focusing in on who needs the treatment, focusing on where the violence is happening, and doing what we can to treat it, or to treat the individual, or to treat the groups. There's a lot of ways that we can go about to cure it, not with medication, but with approaches, with behavior change and with treatments.
Yeah, and do you have any experience or any opinions on using violence interrupters as a resource for communities as a buffer to police action?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in communities where we work, what you'll find is local police officers sometimes, when they're really in tune and they're not letting their any biases kind of control their behavior, they see our violence interrupters as a resource, because they can kind of say, hey, I have this problem in this corner, can you go try to cool it off? They don't say that to the interrupter, but they might say that to the program manager, and then the program manager will maybe have somebody go out there. Yeah, I mean, I don't want it to sound like we are going to be doing the thing that the police officer can be doing instead of them doing it, because that's really not where the solution is. There's a role for police. I mean, we need to have laws that are respected. But the problem is we're not doing anything on the front end. Like there's so much we could do on the front end before violence is even on the table, to interrupt it, to change people's behavior, to treat people. So yeah, I mean, violence interrupters can sort of play this different role way before police. And we can play it so that police are not needed as much and not needed as often, and not put in places where it's super stressful and they're reacting emotionally or they're reacting based on their biases. The more we can reduce those sort of interactions with the community, the less violence there's going to be between police and communities. So, I mean, in that way, I think we can really start to make a difference.
Thank you so much for your explanation. We're going to transition to Lisa, who I think has a presentation.
Yeah, actually, before I do that, I wanted to just comment and echo a lot of what's been said, and reinforce places of agreement. So I really love what Charlie was saying about taking a health approach, and within health and public health, we really concern ourselves with how do we promote the thing that the desired outcome, and then how do we prevent the poor outcome or the adverse outcome, right? And so punishment after a problem develops is not a health or public health strategy. And there's a lot of science that shows, in terms of behavior, human behaviors, that actually supporting people in having access to those conditions that support them in engaging in the desired behavior is actually a lot more effective than punishing somebody for engaging in the behavior after the fact. So hopefully, I think with a lot of the work that's happening across the country around reimagining public safety, there will be really opportunities to invest more in those strategies that, well, what actually creates public safety? Does punishing people after the fact create safety, or does it create punishment? And what in fact actually does safety look like, and what creates that in communities? So really in alignment there. I really loved what you were saying too about understanding people who are impacted by violence. I think we've learned a lot about trauma and resilience informed approaches. And one of the phrases that I really like is when we ask the question, what happened to you, instead of what's wrong with you? And I think similarly, since community is our focus, we can look at what happened to this community, right? Not what's wrong with this community. And when you think about what's happened to this community, in communities that have high rates of community violence, domestic violence, where you see racial and neighborhood-based inequities, a lot of what's happened to those neighborhoods is disinvestment and discrimination. So I'll show that in my presentation a little bit more. But there was one more thing that I wanted to say in terms of how important it is, sort of how do we fundamentally understand the problem, because our fundamental way of understanding the problem informs what we consider as viable solutions, right? So when we're talking about things like police violence, we're talking about interpersonal violence, domestic violence, I think it's actually important to recognize that there are a range of contributors and motivations. And I want to give credit to my colleagues at the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence for what I'm about to share, because this insight has been really helpful to me recently. They really talk about, overall, we live in a culture that promotes and rewards controlling behavior, power over behavior. It celebrates it. You can get very wealthy and powerful by employing strategies that are based on exploitation and domination over land and resources and people. And within that culture, it's no wonder that individuals might look at these strategies and say, hey, that's a viable way to make it in the world. But not everybody engages in violence, right? There are some people who don't. So what are the motivations that might lead somebody down that path? On the one hand, in a culture that really equates success with financial and material success, but at the same time excludes a lot of people from opportunity, it's understandable that if you are excluded from an opportunity to really make it in the world in terms of having basic access to food and economic resources to provide for yourself and your family, that you might need to engage in things that are outside of what is considered legal in order to take care of yourself and your family. Then, thinking about domestic violence, we could also understand that people who are exploited and discriminated against themselves might abuse their power in the context of an interpersonal relationship with somebody that they feel that they can behave in that way, perhaps as a way to compensate for feeling disempowered or devalued or disrespected, or to, just get their needs met in the world, right? And so there's a segment of violence that we feel fundamentally relates to experiences of discrimination and inequity. On the other hand, there are people who have life experiences of unearned privilege, of having access to power and control over other people. And because society confers this status to them based on history, generations, identity, being born into that situation, et cetera. And in those situations, people might exercise power over others as a way of maintaining that privilege and control and position of having greater access, right? So I think there are different forms of violence, and sometimes it is to maintain privilege and power over, and sometimes it is to have strategies ineffective, sometimes illegal, sometimes harmful, to address one's basic needs. So I wanted to put that out there first, and then I can stop to see if anyone has any comments about that before I share my graphic.
No, thank you. I think you can share your graphic now.
Okay, wonderful. So I wanted to share, just talk a little bit more about what we call the pathway to violence and the pathway to safety, using the aid of these graphics that we developed in partnership with the Big Cities Health Coalition. The Big Cities Health Coalition is a coalition of the 30 or more largest health jurisdictions across the country that collectively serve over 60 million people in the United States. So 1 in 5 people are affected by the membership of the Big Cities Health Coalition. And we published this framework called Community Safety Realized earlier this year. And, there's been such a collective rallying call to reimagine community safety. And we wanted to create a tool that would help communities move from imagining or reimagining into realizing community safety. So this pathway here, I'm going to ask you to start where the red arrow is on the left-hand side of your screen. And I'm going to walk you through the gray pathway that we call the pathway to violence. And in our analysis, community violence and racial and geographic inequities in community violence are really rooted in legacies of structural racism and other inequities in this country from the time of the founding of the country to today. And given that these legacies show up in creating inequitable institutions and systems. So I'm going to ask you to follow the red arrow as we go down this pathway. So we have racial and social inequity embedded into institutions, and that is why these institutions have engaged in things like redlining, which is discrimination by race in terms of access to loans and ability to live in particular neighborhoods, or inequitable government investment, like many programs after World War II that were, there was discrimination in who could have access to those government opportunities, and that have created racially and economically segregated neighborhoods. And this is not that long ago that these practices were in place, and many of these practices are still in place. And when you have inequitable institutions and systems, it creates inequitable communities, and communities in which there's a concentration of factors that are known to increase the likelihood of violence. And some of those are broadly characterized as concentrated disadvantage, underfunded schools, et cetera, communities that just don't have the access to the resources to meet community needs. And when you have communities where there's disadvantage concentrated, that means that the people who live in those neighborhoods are going to be exposed to greater risk factors for being exposed to violence or engaging in violence. And that is why we see the rates of community violence that we see and the inequities in injury, trauma, and death. And because the system has been designed in this way, it is absolutely and unequivocally not necessary or inevitable that this be our outcomes. There is a pathway to safety, which I'm going to describe here in this green pathway, that starts, or it doesn't necessarily start, but it is fundamentally rooted in dismantling the legacies of structural racism and creating just institutions and systems that includes everything from equitable investment by financial institutions and government in neighborhoods. When I go to certain neighborhoods in Oakland, California, where I live, actually, I have a memory of this where my daughter said to me, "Can you believe the way this neighborhood looks?" And she was saying that from a place of assuming that the way that the neighborhood looked was a result of the actions of the people in the neighborhood. And I said, "Honey, do you know that our city council, our city government discriminates against people in this neighborhood? Because this neighborhood does not get the same investment in parks or trees or street cleaning or sidewalk maintenance, just these basic fundamental things as other neighborhoods in our city." And she couldn't believe it. She said, "Why is this allowed? Why is this legal?" And I said, power, structural power, and how inequities in decisions have been baked into these systems. And so, sorry, went on a little tangent there, but so we need equitable investments and anti-displacement protections, because one of the things that we've learned is that when neighborhoods start to have more access to investments, gentrification and displacement often follows. And then the people who are the intended beneficiaries of that investment oftentimes become displaced from those neighborhoods. So investing in communities with anti-displacement protections creates the conditions in the community of opportunity and stability and trust. And when people live in neighborhoods that are like that, they are more likely to be exposed to the conditions that they need in their life to be secure and to safe. And that is how we achieve increased safety and healing and the decreases in racial inequities and injury, trauma, and death. So I'm almost done. I'm going to show you a gigantic diagram here, because that analysis basically says that there are many opportunities to intervene. I think Cure Violence's work is represented here. I think we have it, street outreach and violence interruption is shown kind of in the middle of the page. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we have other strategies represented here. Everything from, we were talking about reentry earlier, we have community-led reentry supports down here on the right-hand side, restorative justice, culturally rooted healing practices. And then we also talk about access to safe parks and gardens, greening vacant lots. We talk about resident engagement and neighborhood action planning. We talk about racial and gender justice training. We talk about voting rights, right? The ability for people who are most impacted by violence to have their opportunity to vote protected. And unfortunately, in this country, there are many people who are disenfranchised from voting as a result of many of these inequitable systems that we're talking about. So there's a whole range of strategies that can intervene in the pathway to violence and support the pathway to safety. And like I said earlier, just many opportunities for all of us to be contributing in different ways to building the pathway to safety.
Thank you for your presentation. That was a really great graphics. It relates to Charlie's points about how violence can spread. You've been speaking about how like lack of infrastructure and like lack of resources can really destabilize people. And you talked a lot about, what are the root causes of violence? Like why are people what is causing like all of this is like agitation? It's like, lack of resources, lack of infrastructure, lack of education, people becoming displaced. Like, why wouldn't you become like violent if you're going through so much of that? And then you also talked about the importance of building trust within communities. Like, if we're to decrease violence, then what do we need? We're going to have less violence if the people are able to trust each other. And so we talked a lot about like the process of like violence, like what causes violence, how can we prevent violence? One of the themes that have appeared in the first 2 episodes of our series is trauma policing and the impacts of intergenerational trauma. So what have you seen about that, of trauma policing and intergenerational trauma in your work?
Is that to me or to Lisa?
Whoever wants to answer.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, all violence is related. I mean, first of all, I just want to reflect on Lisa's graphic real quick. I thought it was a beautiful graphic. And what I was really reflecting on is how, there are so many places for intervention. And I was also reflecting on the definition of violence and how, Prevention Institute is doing so much on the structural level and really helping communities to walk through that. Our sort of specialty where we're at is, what's happening on the streets and really trying to like stop the immediate stuff. There's just so many points of intervention where we start to understand violence as a health issue and addressing all violence as a health issue. And there's a lot to do, and there's a lot of spaces to fill, a lot of gaps that we need to start giving capacity to and giving resources to. So yeah, in terms of like all these other kinds of violence, like police violence or violence in the community or violence from one community coming into another community, it's all related. And what precipitates the other, either can precipitate the other. It really, a police shooting can, create trauma in a community and among people that then could create other violence. Violence that a police officer sees or is, or he sees maybe another fellow officer do, that can cause a trauma to that police officer. It could cause that police officer to start to adopt norms of more violence. A new person that comes into a community with existing trauma, like somebody that is returning from prison or somebody who's a friend of somebody in the community that is coming to the community new. I mean, that person could potentially kick off a chain of trauma and exposure. So, I mean, there's a lot of different places where these sort of things can get kicked off. And then there's, of course, as Lisa was walking us through, there's a tremendous amount of history that is very important. And that history can be the history of a community. It could be the history of a city or a country. It could also be the history of a family. You know, intergenerational trauma. Yeah, absolutely. A parent or grandparent who experienced extensive trauma, extensive exposure to violence, yeah, absolutely, that can carry on to their child, either through the norms that they have or through anxieties or fears that they might have, or maybe through actual violence that they might pass on. So yeah, I mean, all of this is related. I think what we really have to focus on is the health perspective, which is getting on top of this and treating it before it's a serious problem, finding points of intervention where we could stop exposure and start the healing. Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about what we're doing right now, the current paradigm of what we have right now, it's really like we're meeting a lot of this stuff with more threats and more punishment and more violence. And I think what we need to do is we need to get to the point is where we're just understanding it all in terms of health, and we're responding as much as possible with care and help and treatment rather than these threats and punishments. And so that to me is how we should understand the whole bigger picture and where we can interact with this problem.
I can thank you, and I can just add and echo and reiterate. I mean, how experiences of violence and trauma, I think Charlie talked about it in terms of the impact it can have on our brain and sort of creating hyper arousal, perceiving threats that don't exist, or interpreting situations as being more of a threat than they actually are. There's lots of research that talks about the impact of experiencing trauma and violence on the brain and nervous system, and particularly for young people whose nervous systems are more, spongy and being formed. So it makes me so sad, actually, honestly, because the people who are exposed to violence, and I'm going to talk personally too, right? Like the ways that I've been impacted by experiences of violence make me more likely to experience violence and make it more difficult for me to create safety in my life. And, or the ways that I've been punished and the fear that I have of punishment and the way that I cope with that fear can be very misunderstood as avoidant behavior or mistrusting behavior, right? It's like not this open, welcoming, vibe. It's this like, I feel threatened. I feel I need to protect myself. I'm ready to protect myself stance, right? And so all of that, is a result of experiencing violence, trauma, and punishment, and it repeats that cycle. And it makes me honestly really sad, because I feel like the people who've been exposed to violence and trauma and punishment deserve, right? Like to be the repair, the opportunity for healing, and the opportunity to have extra support and, extra likelihood that we'll be spared from future incidents, but that's not the case. But so that really points to the need, as we've been talking, to center healing and to really, understand what's happening through the lens of trauma and resilience, and to make ample opportunities for healing and wholeness and restoration to happen. And like Charlie said, that's at the individual level, that's at the family level, that's at the community level, that's at the societal level. Like we need a lot of healing. A lot of healing. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say.
Yeah, and we can see here how trauma and violence is a cycle. There's just so much causing instability for a lot of people, and they don't know how to get out of it? What are the resources for them to get out of it? And what are they even like building towards if all they know is violence and within their families and within their communities? And there's, we've talked some about like family violence. There's different types of violence in terms of like violence within communities, between communities. And there's also state sanctioned violence, like violence between the people and then those in power. What would you say are the connections between all of those? Does one precipitate the other? Are they mutually exclusive? And how should we understand these interactions as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all related, absolutely. And I think when we're understanding violence and we're thinking about violence, I think when we have the health and trauma lens, and when we understand that we're not just talking about actual violence, physical violence, but we're also including threats, and we're also including use of power. Yeah, I mean, all of this is related, and all exposure to any of it can lead to more violence. And so I think that, that's how we should understand it as a whole. And we should understand it from this new sort of framing of the health consequences. When we're thinking about police, we should be looking at them not from, who had the number, how do we judge them by a number of arrests or by level of a particular crime? Or should we be judging them based on health metrics and how, their interactions with communities and how positive they are? And I mean, there's a lot of things to consider from a health perspective that we're currently completely ignoring. And so I think, we should understand all of this as being a health issue, and we should start to be asking questions about how we can be doing better from a health perspective.
Yeah, so you were talking about state-sanctioned violence and intercommunal violence, and does one precipitate the other? And I definitely think that if you want to reduce and intercommunal violence, we have to address the state-sanctioned violence. We have to address the structural violence, because the structural violence creates the conditions for the others. There are neighborhoods in Oakland, California, where yes, there is violence, but not at the same level as other neighborhoods. And that, to me, is a form of structural violence, denying people access to equitable opportunity, equitable education, while hoarding excess of resources for some individuals, and particularly doing that based on a false hierarchy of human value that says that your skin color or your immigration status determines what you have, your value and what you have access to opportunity and access to in your life. Those are all forms of violence in my mind, and those create the conditions for the other types of violence that we see. And it's entirely possible to change that, to make everyone have access to opportunities for safety.
Yeah, and we'll be showing a clip of policing the police.
Just pulling that up now, 1 second, sorry. Okay, can you see this?
Yep.
Great. Okay, I'm going to start it here. Actually, 1 second.
test of in fact remains.
Use force against black people at a far higher rate than against whites. But Newark's public safety director says that is just the reality of fighting crime in his city. You said, quote, blacks are 1.6 times more likely to be stopped than whites, 2.5 times more likely to be arrested, and that police use force in those arrests 3.7 times more often. But you also said those numbers could create a false impression that the police disproportionately target black people. What did you mean by that?
So our homicides, I think we're at 22 homicides this year. About 94% are African Americans. I don't condone racial profiling. I don't condone police officers locking anybody up for their race or their gender or their creed or religion, anything like that. But the numbers are the numbers.
Newark's federal monitor is currently investigating whether the police are disproportionately targeting black people or whether, as Ambrose says, they're simply responding to crime. But regardless, crime stats have long been cited as justification for an aggressive type of policing that critics see as an unrelenting knee on the neck of entire communities.
Thanks, Angelina, for showing that. So in the video, it showed how like this police officer was like using statistics to justify using more their tactics on the people. And I'm wondering, in your work, have you seen some of that? And I'm also wondering, like, what is your opinion of that? And like, should we, or how can we move away from numbers are the numbers as a justification for police violence?
I could start if you like. I mean, I love this clip and I love that we're talking about this. And this is a question because this is really, to me, it's the heart of the argument for people that are like, wanting to double down on police and wanting more police. And so really getting at the heart of this question, I think, can help to maybe help explain this, or at least help everyone understand what it is that the other side is getting wrong. I think we can look at what's happening and see that something is going wrong, right? I mean, the violence is massively concentrated. The arrests are massively concentrated. There's something broken here. Something is not right. And when we even like even people that like are wanting to reform policing or criminal justice reform, or let's try to let's talk about violence. It's all within the framing of criminal justice. It's all like, how much policing? How are we going to defund police? The argument is over policing. When we see violence on TV, they're interviewing police officers to talk about it. Politicians, when violence jumps, they're motivated to fund police. We need to break out of that whole framing. I mean, it's just the wrong paradigm. It's the wrong way to understand like how you affect people's behavior. Just reflect on your own behavior for a minute. Whatever issues you have in your life, diet, exercise, maybe drinking or substance abuse or smoking or whatever risky behavior or behavior you'd like to change. Are you going to change and respond based on threats or somebody who you don't even know coming in telling you that you need to do this or else? Or is it support from people that you trust? I mean, it's in terms of changing behaviors, we can do so much more by being supportive, being credible, by coming to people in a place of trust, by worrying about how people receive us and receive a person and kind of make adjustments and meet them where they're at and help them in the ways that they need to be helped. Violence, it's so clearly a health problem. We see the health effects of it. We can understand behavior as a health problem. But when we start to do this, we really start to understand the person differently. We get out of that criminal justice threats, like how do we stop this behavior? Well, let's crack down on this person. And we can start to understand that person differently. It's not just this bad behavior, but we understand, what has happened to them. What can we do to address what has happened to them? Instead of this system where we're essentially, people are getting thrown away. Like how do we address individuals? Well, we throw away the ones that are, violating something. We need to get into the business of lifting people up. We could see, we could define, we diagnose what happened to this individual. What do they need? Now, none of this is to say that, a new paradigm of how we imagine violence and all behavior in our community. It's not to say that we're throwing away police or defunding. That's the wrong debate. What we need to be debating is how can we increase community capacity? How can we make police less needed in a community? How can we reduce the number of interactions to reduce the likelihood of something happening emotionally? And we do this by changing the entire framing to violence as a health issue. When we start to understand people and the problem and the behavior through a health lens, I think that's just really the key to changing the entire debate and changing the entire way in which we think about what communities can do to manage behavior.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think I want to talk about 3 things to get at this whole notion of the numbers are the numbers. I want to talk about mapping multiple issues that are related to concentrated disadvantage. I want to talk about the legacy of structural racism in the criminal justice system. And I want to talk about implicit bias and why sometimes it's really hard to see racism playing out. So the first one around the it sounded like this officer was saying, well, if rates of violence are high, then arrests are going to be higher, and all these things, and so it's all justified. If you map community violence rates, redlining, racial discrimination in lending, and you map diabetes, poverty, domestic, a whole range of issues, you're going to see the impact of concentrated disadvantage and residential segregation. And so the numbers are the numbers, not because of something inherent about individual people. It's really about the zip code and the life experience and what people are exposed to. So now I want to talk about some examples of structural racism within the criminal justice system that might help people to see that what we see is really part of a legacy. So structural racism is firmly embedded within the criminal legal system. It's firmly embedded in all of our systems. So it's not just the criminal legal system, but just to give a couple examples of how it's embedded in the criminal legal system. So law enforcement units and militias were established and expanded, and specific laws related to gun ownership were shaped at the end of the institution of slavery. And actually during the institution of slavery as well. If you have watched the documentary, I think it's called 13th, that talks about the 13th Amendment. And so the 13th Amendment was made to the United States Constitution in 1865. It abolished slavery for everyone except for people convicted of crimes. So slavery and involuntary servitude is still permitted in the United States as a punishment for crime. And after slavery, after the 13th Amendment, there was a proliferation of laws and practices by law enforcement and militia that arrested African Americans, incarcerated them, and then continued to exploit the labor of incarcerated African Americans to perpetuate the exploitation of the labor of African Americans. That's one example. There are other examples of discrimination within the criminal legal system, the ways that laws are punishment, are harsher sentences, education policies that are push students of color out of school and into the criminal legal system, Jim Crow laws that discriminate, etc. There's a whole range of policies and practices that where the criminal legal system and structural racism are completely intertwined. So it is, I think it's really important to, if that is our history, right, we can expect that those practices are going to show up in different ways beyond the specific examples I just explained. So in my mind, the impacts of structural racism are everywhere, every day. And so that leads me to wanting to talk a little bit about implicit bias and why it can be really hard to see that what is actually going on. And Dr. Gail Christopher, she was formerly with Kellogg, and she was the creator of Kellogg's work, Kellogg Foundation's work on truth, reconciliation, and healing around racial inequity and racial justice. And she really talks about, we have to be willing to admit that there is a false ideology operating in our systems that gives differential value to human life based on this construct of race. There's actually, race is a construct. There are phenotypic differences among human beings: skin color, eye color, height, shape of different physical features. Those are phenotypic differences between human beings. There's actually no such thing as racial categories of people, but we have this ideology that says there are races, and then we assign differential value to human beings based on this ideology of race. And it's really important that we just admit that. I mean, and of course, this is going to be different for different people based on your racial identity and your racial experience. But, last year I read the book White Supremacy in Me, and, I'm a multiracial person. The majority of my community and the people in my family are people of color. And I read this book and I thought, I'm already an ally. Oh my goodness, it was so enlightening. I was able to say, you know what, white supremacy and like white saviorism or white exceptionalism, these nuances of the way that this ideology operated within my own self, really painful to admit. But I think it's the work that we all need to do. We just have to tell the truth about this, and we have to reckon with it. And it's difficult to see. It's sort of intentionally made invisible, but the numbers are not the numbers as if that is some inherent, just the way it is. There's a whole complex history to why things are the way they are. And we need to tell the truth about that.
Yeah, and I'm seeing from the both of you like a very deep understanding of people, or like of yourselves, and also like a need for people to understand themselves more. Like violence comes intergenerationally. There's power dynamics between like races and other like demographics of people. It's also relates to the resources that are available to them. There's all of these like interconnected issues, and also like a deep investigation of the roots of the issues and like psychology. So what I'm hearing is that, and what I'm seeing is, when we treat the numbers as the numbers, and we treat people as numbers and violence as numbers, and you miss like all of the nuances and all like the processes that lead up to like even one event of violence, which states to a lot of the issues of like why like we keep why like the solutions towards violence that we've been seeing in like our nation have been very unimpressive towards the people. And also, like when we talk about community violence, it's often that we're looking at the aftermath of the violence. We're not looking at what comes before. You both talked about the precursors to the violence, but I'm wondering what are, like when I say like what are the precursors to violence, like what are the most important ones to you?
I mean, the most important predictor of violence is a past exposure to violence. I mean, that is the most, that's the best way to predict future violence. So it might be a violent act that then has a retaliation that you could step in and stop. It might be a police shooting that is traumatizing individuals that you could step in and you could address that trauma. It might be a family. And, as Lisa's talking and the work that Prevention Institute is doing to address these structural problems, I think the structural violence is everywhere and we could see it. And so there are ways that we can address it. And it's very much, I think, unfortunately, longer term work and it's deeper work. I think there's a lot we could do much more urgently in terms of violence in the communities right now. And that's what Cure Violence is doing. I mean, I think, I think when it comes to all of this stuff, we're kind of expecting to move mountains here with like a handful of people. And like places where we've worked, like Cherry Hill in Baltimore. That's a community that we've had go a year without shootings. A year without killing, I think, like 2 or 3 times, different times in its 6 or 7 year history of the program. And I mean, that was done on the backs of like 7 or 8 people. They're the ones who were able to achieve these huge reductions in violence. Imagine if we had like 20 or 30 people. Imagine if we had, large amount of capacity to organizations who are addressing structural issues. I mean, we're expecting to move mountains here with just a few people. We really need to kind of start taking things seriously here and really doubling down on things that we know are needed. Right now, taking things seriously, I think that means doubling down on police for a lot of people. Something that's not worked, something that's not really it doesn't really have evidence for most of what policing does. So yeah, I mean, I think we just really need to start doubling down on what we know works. Like these intervention points that you're talking about, we need to invest in those intervention points and see what we can do to move that.
Yeah, I feel like, as I stated before, I think the biggest predictors or precursors to violence is structural discrimination and racism and the things that create concentrated disadvantage. When people, and I agree also exposure to violence, if you've been exposed to violence generationally and you don't have access to the same opportunities in terms of quality education or the ability to get a job that pays enough to have a secure home and food security and those types of things, we put people in positions where they, have very few choices available to them. I think, looking at the places where we're creating those conditions in people's lives is probably the place to look for precursors. We can't hear you, Olivia.
Thank you for summarizing that so succinctly for our stakeholders. At this moment, we're also taking questions from the audience, and we have some questions already. We have some questions about the role of government and intervening or eliminating violence. We have a question that's speaks more to like, does the government do we need a willing government to intervene in structural violence? And then we have another question on getting governments to invest and engage in working to eliminate violence. And the person is saying it seems as though it's would be untypical for governments, as it feels like we're in a police state.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of like, is it government's role? I mean, I think the safety of the community is one of its fundamental primary goals. Yeah, I mean, if the government is failing to understand that keeping the public safe is one of their main goals, one of their main responsibilities, then we have a major problem. It's absolutely government's responsibility. And furthermore, governments are in a position where they can fund these kind of approaches. They could fund, but while I say there's a role for government, it's really in supporting and funding this. The actual work, it's got to be done from a place of credibility, and that goes for the structural stuff, that goes for the street stuff, that goes for all of it. And that means it has to be done by people that the community is okay with. And that could be defined in a lot of ways, but it's defined by the community, and it's defined by the problem. So we have to, as a government, what people have to do is realize where the problem is, the community that it's in, invest in that community with this kind of approaches that can get on top of the violence. So there's absolutely a way for governments to get involved. In terms of like government's ability to fund stuff, the American Recovery Plan has given cities a ton of money. And Baltimore, I know, is investing $50 million. They just announced this week, specifically for violence prevention. The Biden administration is talking about $5 billion over 8 years for violence prevention. So governments absolutely can. It's about prioritization. I mean, when people talk about budget issues, can we really do this? Or we have too much invested in police. I mean, it's a matter of priorities. And it's really just astounding to me that violence prevention is not a bigger priority, because public safety is just a fundamental responsibility of the government, and we're failing at that right now.
Yeah, I have a similar, opinion that the work has to be community driven. Safety in people's lives, that's found in the fabric of people's relationships and families and a community life, and that's not something that government entities can police or dictate or legislate, right? At the same time, government has a tremendous impact on people's lives, and in either creating inequity or equity. And so I agree that really looking at the places where government is creating inequity and what can be done to correct that is really important. And I agree, the American Rescue Plan Act funds are a great opportunity. The Build Back Better Act, if we can get it passed, is also going to create tremendous amount of opportunities. And so unfortunately, if community is not at the table advocating for how those funds should be used, they probably will not be distributed equitably. So I really encourage folks who are working on violence and other issues to make sure to get involved in those decisions and be in those conversations and advocate for your community's needs. Because otherwise there won't be invested equitably. I have a little anecdote from another community that we worked in, where we were really promoting a community-driven approach. And so then some of the county folks started to say, oh, there's no role for us here. We just can sit back. And no, because in just one example, one of the things that the community was really asking for was more opportunities for young people. Come to find out, the one neighborhood youth center had been closed down several years prior. And so there was very little for young people to do in this neighborhood. And that is absolutely the responsibility, was the decision of the Parks and Rec Department, of the city government, of the county government, to make those decisions to close down that center. And so the job of the folks in government was then to figure out how to get that center opened up again and respond to what the community was really asking for. And then there are other, roles that government can play. Prevention Institute, we work a lot with health departments, public health departments, and some of the things that I think government can do is, for example, we have a lot of access to data. We can use, actually, why am I saying we? I don't work for government, I work for a nonprofit. Government entities can help to describe and explain and tell the story of the things that we are talking about right now, using the access to data, using the other tools that it has to get education and get these messages out and to be a voice for these reimagining processes. Government can make sure there are structures and processes for community members to be at the table for making decisions. Government can use its convening power to create processes like you all are doing to bring young organizers and community leaders and elected officials and others together to create these kinds of plans. Government can be a role model in practicing the kind of truth telling that I was talking about and the accountability to addressing systemic racism. So, and government can pass resources on to community groups to implement a variety of different types of strategies, including cure violence and the other kinds of strategies that we just talked about. So there's plenty of work for government entities to do, but it's not to be in charge and not to make all the decisions.
I just want to emphasize something you said, Lisa. I mean, I appreciate everything you brought here. But like, governments are people with voices and platforms. And it's not all just money. They can convene people. They can go into a community and have conversations with people and talk to people about. There's so much that that government officials and elected officials can do here. And honestly, I think a lot more are doing it now. I'm surprised that it takes so much coaxing to get people to do this in some places. But yeah, we're seeing, I mean, the mayor of Baltimore is a great example of a leader who's stepping up and talking about violence as a health issue. The mayor of Atlanta is another example. I mean, this can happen, and there's a lot of great examples of people doing this.
Yeah, you spoke a lot about how government officials can, do more and give some recommendations on how they can prevent violence and address violence. I'm wondering for those watching, if you have, if you have any recommendations for the people watching on how to get involved with your work, learn more about your work, or if there's any resources you'd like to share.
I'll go quick. It's always a standoff here. Who's going to go? I mean, our website's cureviolence.org or cvg.org. They both take you to the same place. I mean, I think one of the things that we put together recently is a report on our evidence on cure violence. It really, it's 8 evaluations, another dozen studies, and it's endorsements and kind of people. It's a return on investment calculation. So, if you go to the resources page, it's just cvg.org/resources. And so there's the evidence that you can use to talk in your community about how approaches like this work. I mean, if you have a site in your community that is doing this kind of work, you can reach out to that site and help support them. I think for most people in a community, that's going to be the most impactful thing you can do, look for who's doing the work and support them. If nobody's doing the work, then start pushing city government to make it happen.
Great. And our website is www.preventioninstitute.org, and I can be reached at lisa@preventioninstitute.org. Actually, Google works really well. And when I go to our website, there is a search function, but a lot of times I'll actually just Google, try to, find our resources. But we did release Community Safety Realized earlier this year. It's a paper. Would love for you all to take a look at it and give us feedback on how to improve it, because I'm sure it can be improved upon. But please feel free to reach out to me. I agree, Charlie, it's always best to connect with folks locally, but I really enjoy talking to different people and just being a sounding board, being a thought partner, being a cheerleader to, keep encouraging people to do the good work, and also a connector, because I get to work with a lot of different communities across the country and know about different examples of different things happening. So let's stay in touch and continue to be in conversation about these important issues.
Yeah, so Angelina will be showing a feedback survey on screen with the QR code. So please fill that in so that we can apply your feedback. And just a great thanks to our Angelina for technical stuff, Taili for heading this, and Lisa and Charlie for being here. We talked a lot about looking at violence as not just a singular event, but as many, many processes, and the importance of like understanding the humanity that, and like all the processes that that causes violence, that makes violence spread, and seeing addressing violence not as punishment, but also as a process, and a need to build trust with people, a need to really investigate what the people need, and also bringing power to communities. And one question that we'd like to leave you off with is, how do we move from where we are now to a place of healing between marginalized communities, the police, and communities that do not share these same experiences? And thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, everyone.
And as we close, we're going to actually put the link in the YouTube page for the policing the police. I ask all folks who are watching this episode to actually tune in if you plan on coming to the next episode. I think we'll have a surprise guest for you all in the next episode, moving from this conversation to possibly looking at actions to be taking place. And just so you all know, we will be in communication with Charlie and Lisa, and hopefully bringing them to our community to help community organizations engage in this work. So again, thank you, Charlie and Lisa, for being here. Thank you, Olivia, for being a great and honorous moderator. And thank you, Angelina, for all the technical work in the background. And this was a great evening, and it was everything that I expected and more. So thank you all. And